Good evening, everyone. My name's Malcolm Hackett and I chair the board of BRI. Welcome to the third webinar of our 2024 series, Houses and Best Practice Bushfire Risk Reduction. Many inquiries and published research following large bushfires have shown a link between the survival of homes and buildings in a bushfire and the survival of people. When retrofitting or extending an existing home or designing a new build in a bushfire-prone area, the Australian Standard Construction of Buildings in Bushfire-Prone Areas, AS 3959, applies. The standard provides a method for assessing a site's exposure to bushfire and the specific construction requirements for responding to that exposure. The standard refers to this as Bushfire Attack Level, or BAL. The design process, including choice of materials, can be complex and it has cost implications. Building and planning compliance adds additional considerations with requirements varying from state to state. Tonight, we will take you through the planning and building requirements for retrofitting or extending an existing home and for a new home. We will explain BAL, what the BAL levels mean, how a BAL will support you to understand and respond to your risk, the role of a BAL in planning and building requirements, where to get support and advice, the concept of best practice when extending or retrofitting or designing a new home. Tonight, we have three presenters, Justin Leonard, Kevin Hazel, and Mark Holland. Following the presentations, we will have a discussion and question and answer session with Justin, Kevin, and Mark before finishing at 9 p.m. This series of presentations has been organised by Bushfire Resilience Incorporated, an independent community-led not-for-profit. Our mission is to improve community engagement in reducing bushfire risk by providing expert knowledge and promoting it to households in a timely and practical manner. These webinars have been organised on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. BRI and our presenters acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands from which the presenters and you join us tonight, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples, their ongoing cultures, and 65,000-year connection to the lands and waters across Australia. Please note that the webinars and the presenters are providing information. It's not advice. Our intention is to provide general information about risks to property, people, and animals. It's your responsibility to seek advice for your particular situation. This may be a sensitive topic for some people. Suggested services are shown on the screen. Thank you to our sponsors and supporters, the Bendigo Bank Community Bank branches in Nillumbik and Kinglake, the CFA, the Warrandyte Riverside Market, the Nillumbik Shire Council, the City of Manningham, the Warrandyte Bridge over the Yarra, and Davey Pumps. Thank you for registering your interest and for submitting your pre-webinar questions. You are able to ask questions as we proceed using the Q&A function, but please keep the questions short and to the point. These webinars are being recorded and everyone who has subscribed will be sent the link. Our presenters are industry experts. Justin Leonard has dedicated his 27-year research career to understanding of how bushfire risk to life and infrastructure can be managed. This research combines learning from bushfire exposure experiments, post-bushfire survey investigations, and computer modelling of bushfire interactions with buildings. Justin has been a very regular BRI presenter since we began in 2020. He always provides information that our audience can relate to and apply. Kevin is a town planner who specialises in land use planning responses to bushfire. He works with state and local governments to ensure bushfire risk management is embedded in policy and strategic planning proposals. Mark's career with the CFA has concentrated on buildings in high-risk areas. He manages CFA's land use planning team with a focus on strategic land use planning and planning permit referrals. Please remember, you're able to turn on captions in Zoom in the footer if you're having problems with the sound level. Kevin will now provide his presentation. Thank you, Kevin.
Good evening, folks, and thanks, Malcolm. I'm coming to you from Launceston in Tasmania. So initially, what do we want to get out of this part of the session, which will go for about 25 minutes? The first is to understand the context for bushfire resilience, and this will reiterate some of the things you may have heard in previous seminars. The second is to learn more about bushfire attack levels. And the third is to appreciate bushfire protection measures that can be deployed to enhance safety. So let's have a think about bushfire resilience and the changing threat from bushfire. What we know is that we have longer fire seasons, and the fire season is arriving earlier in spring. We know that these fire seasons are accompanied by more extreme heat waves, including in spring, and that lower rainfall during the cooler months in some fire-prone regions of the southwest and southeast of Australia is to be expected. We're going to get hotter drought periods as well. And there's also evidence of more favourable environments for fire-generated thunderstorms. The Royal Commission into the Black Summer bushfires gathered a lot of evidence from different parts of the country. One part of it was to really think about the idea that there is this trend towards more weather-dominated fire events. Weather-dominated fire events are where fires interact with the atmosphere, resulting in unpredictable and extreme fire behaviour, essentially firestorms. And we know that the number of them is increasing significantly over time. And you can see there the 2019 bar showing that there was a significant number of those events during the Black Summer in that year. In terms of forms of bushfire behaviour, this is really important because it connects back into the bushfire attack levels and the things you might do on your property to make yourself safer. So radiant heat is a heat you can feel from a fire. So think of that as a fireplace. The closer you get to it, the hotter it is, the further away, the cooler it is. It works the exact same way in the natural environment. The closest you or a structure are to a bit of vegetation, the hotter it will get, the further away, the cooler it will get if the vegetation is on fire. That's radiant heat. Next one there is flame contact from a fire front. This is where your structure is actually going to be touched by flames coming out of the vegetation where it's in a mostly natural state. So flame contact is what it means. The flames are touching the structure. The third type there is ember attack, burning twigs, leaves and bark carried by wind, landing in and around a building, a person or a place. We've then got extreme fire behaviour. So this is what I just referenced on the previous slide. The idea that there's these areas within and in proximity to high-risk landscapes, high-risk areas, characterised by long fire runs, steep topography and vegetation in a mostly natural condition. The potential, if that catches on fire, for extreme fire behaviour to come out of it, and that includes extreme ember attack. The next one being localised flame contact. This is really important to how you might manage your gardens. Localised flame contact is things that might be burning very close to your structure. It could be your garden, your side fence, the shed, your wood pile, all the things that sit on properties that can catch fire, primarily from ember attack, that they themselves become a source of bushfire attack. And the last one there is the wind change of directions. And particularly in the southern Australia, the hot, dry winds typically come from the north and northwest, followed by that late afternoon wind change. And that wind change strongly influences our worst bushfire days, with significant destruction occurring within a couple of hours of that wind change happening. So those forms of bushfire behaviour is what we're trying to deal with at a regulatory and a property protection perspective. And different parts of the response deal with different forms of bushfire behaviour. There's an unpredictability in bushfire, which can be very frustrating to citizens as well as to practitioners. This is just an example of lightning strikes in Tasmania over a 2-day period. Lightning can cause fire. That's how many lightning strikes occurred. The unpredictability of bushfire, with all due respect to my flood colleagues, is one of the key challenges in bushfire. It just is unpredictable to an extent that makes it very difficult to manage. Also, some reflections. After every major fire event in Victoria, there's a report prepared by the Inspector General for Emergency Management, and this was his report after the Black Summer fires in Victoria. He made 3 really key points. The first was simply building a vast bushfire response capability, more aircraft, trucks and equipment, is on balance no more useful than it is affordable. What is required is something more sophisticated, something that takes the best from a whole range of different approaches and that brings them together to get good outcomes. The second point made reiterates what I said earlier. Those who take a long-term view, the environmental context is evidently changing. The impacts of climate change are evident in the natural and settled landscape, and that the incidence of large, severe and recurrent bushfire events in Victoria has increased exponentially over recent years, and importantly, shows no signs of slowing. And the last point, which is really relevant to us as people, the human context is changing too. Victoria's bush population is steadily growing. People are looking to live different lives in different places beyond the city, and some of the fastest growing parts of our state are in bushfire areas. Many Victorians have probably never considered the possibility of confronting a bushfire or grass fire and must now adapt to that risk. And keep in mind that those comments were made before COVID, so obviously COVID's also generated a shift that probably is putting even more people into bushfire areas. So essentially, the Inspector General, following the Black Summer fires, said, we can't buy our way out of the problem. The environment's getting worse, and we're putting more people into bushfire areas. And that's probably not a bad summary of the bushfire situation across the country. One of the key things I bang on about a fair bit is about the scales of assessment. What scale are we working to? And I just want to reiterate this over the next few slides. If we look at the picture on the left-hand slide, it might be a town anywhere in the country, and you might well say there's not too much bushfire risk in that town. And that may or may not be true. But what's really important is to always zoom out, as I call it, and to see what's going on in that broader landscape, because that's given you the true appreciation of what the bushfire risk is. If you zoom in too close to your property and you have a frame of reference that's too focused on your property, you can sometimes miss the big bushfire risk. Taking that theme further, again, a relatively low risk settlement there. You may not think there's much going on. When you zoom out, you see there's significant bushfire risk, and that is in fact Marysville. So we always need to make sure that we're looking outwards, we're looking beyond our individual property to see what's going on in that broader landscape. Thinking about another scenario, this looks like a town centre with a bit of vegetation to its north. If you zoom out, you'll see it's actually a bit of riparian corridor. So there is a bit of fire risk coming out of that, but self-evidently, it's not like the forest in the previous slide. So it also tells you something about the risk. In this case, the risk might be lower when you zoom out than what it looks like when you look just at your site and the immediate surrounds. Once again, another site, a bit of forest that sits behind it. Not sure what the risk is, but once you zoom out, you get a much better appreciation of what the risk is. Again, it's not, it's a bit of vegetation, but it's self-evidently not a massive forest. So always have a think about what scales we're working to, and that filters its way through to how you might appreciate bushfire risk on your properties and the things you might then do in response to it. The final one here is looking about 3 paddocks. You might look at those 3 paddocks, they could be anywhere in the country, and you might say, well, the bushfire response for that property, you might be a farmer, you might own one of those lots, is going to be very similar on all 3 sites. And when you look at that scale of assessment, you may well be right. But again, when you zoom out, you'll see that these are 3 different paddocks on 3 different sides of a town. In this case, it's Castlemaine in central Victoria, and each of those sites has a highly variable and different bushfire risk profile coming into it. So again, only by looking out, by looking over our neighbour's fence, by looking beyond our community, can we start to see the true nature of the bushfire risk. So really just reiterating the need to keep that in your mind, folks, as you think about how bushfire might affect you and your family. So let's have a chat about bushfire attack levels. First of all, a bushfire attack level is a technical process, and whilst it can be straightforward, it's not always straightforward, like all technical process. But I guess essentially over the next 10 minutes, what I want you to understand is the basics of how they are derived, even if you can't or won't ever determine one for yourself. But how do the basic mechanics of this thing work? So essentially a bushfire attack level, this is an extract from the Australian Standard, is just a means of measuring the severity of a building's exposure to ember attack, radiant heat and flame contact. That's all it is. It simply says how much bushfire might be thrown at a structure if the nearby vegetation is on fire. So let's unpack a little bit about how it does that. It was mentioned earlier about the Australian Standard. That's it there. And essentially in that Australian Standard, it has sort of essentially 5 bushfire attack levels. They essentially just link to a construction response. And some of the terminology sometimes gets a bit confusing, all these numbers and that sort of thing. It didn't have to be numbers. It could have been levels 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It could have been A, B, C, or D, or E. It doesn't really matter. All that you need to know is that there's certain categories of assessment, and those categories derive a construction response in a dwelling or a structure. That's all you need to really know. The ins and outs of what the different attack levels are isn't as relevant when you're trying to determine a bushfire attack level. And within the Australian Standard, this initially rather confusing table, that basically is how you prepare a bushfire attack level assessment. And we'll go through that and have a think about how that plays out on any given site. Thinking about that table and the top bit there, I'll just move it on to the next screen and we'll see what it looks like when you zoom in. So that's that top bit of the table inserted here. So essentially the table helps us prepare an assessment of what the bushfire attack level might be, but we need to understand, well, what's this table doing? How does it help us get there? Well, the first thing it does, it identifies a range of vegetation types. Vegetation types can be obtained by looking at some images that sit within the Australian Standard, and there's also a whole series of advice published by fire authorities about how you can get the vegetation assessment correct. But essentially, the purpose of assessing the vegetation types is that different vegetation will produce different levels of radiant heat. So the type of vegetation close to a site therefore tells us something about the level of radiant heat. And from the purpose of the Australian Standard, the bushfire hazard is these vegetation types. So the first step you need to do in a bushfire attack level assessment is to work out what the vegetation is on and around your site. The next part of the table is this bit here that talks about slopes. In order to do a bushfire attack level, we need to know what the slope is underneath the vegetation on and around our site. The reason, again, the Australian Standard has little images to help us unpack what the slope might be. And the reason why slope is really important is that slope influences the rate of spread, intensity, and the amount of radiant heat produced by a bushfire. And essentially in this bottom row here, as the fire runs up the hill towards the structure, it'll essentially burn hotter and harder. Therefore, it'll spit out more bushfire onto a structure. So the site assessment is trying to pick that up, albeit in a relatively simple way. It is trying to reflect what will happen if a bushfire is occurring on or close to a site. So assessing the vegetation is really important, and assessing the slope is really important. And then essentially with those inputs, we're able to think about what the distance is between the building rather, and the assessed bushfire hazard. And that's what these numbers do. And they do initially seem really confusing, but they're actually really straightforward. The tool is actually, once you get to this point, really straightforward. The first thing to keep in mind is that you need to know the edge of the hazard. If you've got to work out your separation from what will be on fire, you need to have an edge to it. And if you look at somewhere like this, if that was a paddock you're working on in the middle there, you can work out where the edge of in this case, forest would be. So that's really straightforward. If you had this area, you've got a grassland paddock to the east, you could pretty much work out where the edge of that grassland is, and you can then do your calculation or your measurement. Unfortunately, some parts of the country look like this, where the edge of the vegetation or the edge of the hazard isn't detectable. And that's one of the complexities of using the Australian Standard and using the tool. It's not that this picture on the right doesn't have an answer, it just doesn't have a clear hazard edge that makes the answer particularly easy to derive. And so essentially, in thinking about bushfire attack levels, have a think about what the edge of your vegetation looks like, what the edge of the hazard looks like, because that's a really important input to then doing the site assessment. So once we know what the edge is, however, then we can in a relatively straightforward way, just use the table. Let's unpack how that might work. So say we have a site on one side which has forest. So we've assessed it, we've worked out that it's forest. We've confirmed that the land is flat. What we know is that we're now in this row of the table. So that's really straightforward. What we then can do is work out very simply that if you're 48 to 100 metres away from the edge of that forest, you would get a bell 12.5. If you were 35 to 48 metres away from that forest, you would get a bell 19. If you were 25 to 35 metres away from that forest, you would get a bell 29, and so on. And essentially, once you know your veg type and once you know the slope of your land, you've got an edge of the hazard, you can then run this table, as I call it, run the table, and in a very straightforward way, get a bushfire attack level that comes out of it. There is some complexity though. The first is that vegetation is not static. So that edge of the vegetation could be modified or might be changed through things like vegetation removal. Now that might cut across vegetation protection regulations. So you always need to check what exemptions are in place or whether approvals may be required. But you might go through this cycle more than once. You might work out on the first go that you're between 19 and 25 metres away from the forest, so you've got a bell 40, and you might find that you can clear some vegetation. And that might mean that you can now get a separation of 25 to 35 metres, which will allow you to now get a bell 29. So it's just that interaction between the vegetation you start with, that hazard. Can you change that vegetation? Is it on your land? You might be able to change it. If it's on your neighbour's land, you definitely can't change it. If you're abut a national park, the government will definitely not let you change it. So there is some interaction there about whether or not you can change the vegetation. If it is on your land, you may need approval to remove it, and that approval may or may not be granted. Keep running through the cycle until you get to the end point where you know what's the final edge of your bushfire hazard, and then you can run the table to get to the bushfire attack level. So there might be a couple of iterations going through this. Again, even that seems a little bit confusing because it's all numbers and it's all in a table. So let's unpack what it might look like if we sort of get rid of the numbers a little bit and stick some houses in there. So again, we've got the veg classifications and we've got the slope up here and we've got all these numbers. Let's stitch the numbers and let's put the houses in there. So essentially, we've still got forest, we've still got flat land, and we're still working on this row. The bushfire hazard is here. If your house is that far away from the hazard, you've got a bell flame zone, the flames will be touching your house. As your house moves further away from the bushfire hazard, from what's on fire, as the distance gets bigger, as the separation gets bigger, your bushfire attack level reduces. And that is relatively intuitive. As the house moves further away from what's on fire, the construction response has to do less. The further away you are, the less exposure you'll get to bushfire. Therefore, the construction response doesn't need to do as much. So just think about that. Instead of thinking about the table and all these numbers, all the numbers are doing is telling us how close or how far away are you from what will be on fire. And using that information, you derive your bushfire attack level and the construction response that you then use to mitigate against the likely bushfire. And then when you get to the answer, you've worked out you're this far away from the bushfire hazard, you're a bell 12.5, you need to make sure that that separation distance isn't compromised over time, that you actually achieve the separation required, you don't revegetate, and that you allow for that area of what we in Victoria call defendable space, but essentially vegetation management for bushfire purposes. Now, if you're going through a regulatory system, certainly around the country, your planning system will require that area to be protected. Depending on what state you're in, the building system may require it, but sometimes doesn't require it. Entirely up to landowners to maintain that distance. But if you don't maintain that separation distance, your bushfire attack level and this careful arrangement of the structure in relation to where the bushfire hazard is falls apart. So it's really important to do that. Again, if you were separated from the hazard about this far from it, you'd be bell 29. You're now closer to the hazard. You're going to receive more bushfire coming out of the hazard, so your construction response has to do more. That's why it's a bell 29. But again, you still need to maintain that separation, that distance, as to make sure that the fire stops where we think it's going to stop, or we've planned for it to stop. If you were to prepare or commission a bushfire hazard site assessment or a bell assessment from a practitioner, they'd prepare a diagram like this. At the moment, I've just focused over the last few minutes on one aspect, one side of a dwelling or a structure, but you need to do it on all sides. So you look at the vegetation on all sides of the proposed structure. Will be different vegetation types. You'll have different slopes. You'll have different setbacks that you might want to achieve. But for each of those, you need to do what we just did over the past 5 minutes. How close or how far away is your house from the bushfire hazard on each aspect, and you would derive a bushfire attack level on each aspect. The higher one applies to the whole dwelling. So you work around all of the aspects, the higher one you get applies to the whole dwelling. So essentially, keep in mind, it's mostly relevant about bushfire attack levels for new buildings and rebuilt buildings and extensions. If you've got an existing building, perhaps instead of asking what's your bushfire attack level, it's probably better to ask, in my mind, what construction techniques can you apply to your existing dwelling to make it more resilient? Because it's a more relevant question. And fire authorities publish this information. So, for instance, the CFA has lots of information on making roofs, windows, doors, and decks more bushfire resilient. A lot of those elements are embedded in bushfire attack levels, but if you've already got your house built, well, then you're retrospectively doing them. And there's lots you can do. It's not necessarily a bushfire attack level. It's just making the construction of your dwelling more resilient. The resource hub for the BRI also has some interesting information about what you can do, but all fire authorities publish it. This is a South Australian fire service. They've published lots of information too. So there's plenty of information out there about how you can make the way a structure is built more resilient to bushfire. Also need to keep in mind that for new buildings and some extensions, a bushfire attack level is not a regulatory requirement under building systems. So essentially, if you are in a bushfire area, it'll be a building system requirement that you do this. And so therefore, it's a statutory requirement to do it. In some places, new lots will come with a bell that was determined when the subdivision of land was approved. So if you were to buy into a growth area of a regional city, you'll buy that lot, and that lot will have a bushfire attack level predetermined, and you buy the lot knowing what the bushfire attack level will be. That's pretty common in Victoria and in other jurisdictions as well. In some places, new buildings and some extensions may require a planning permit. So this becomes before a building permit. So in that case, the bell may not be a landowner choice, but a bell requirement, but a planning requirement on acceptable exposure to bushfire. So often people will say, I'm happy living with a bell 40, I'm happy to build to that standard. Well, for example, in Victoria, the state government says, well, we're not happy for you to be built to a bell 40. We don't want you to be exposed to that level of bushfire. We require you to be further separated from the bushfire hazard to achieve a lower bushfire attack level. So it may not always be a landowner choice. The second point there is that the bell may be derived from that wider risk, zoom out, and not always from that site risk, which is what the Australian standard focuses on. And that's essentially why we have a planning system. The Australian standard and the building system wants to focus on the site. The planning systems around this country want to focus on the zoom out. Where are the big bits of risk and making sure your structure is resilient to that. The bell may sometimes be preset. In Victoria, some selected settlements have a preset bell, and these are shown within a planning scheme. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes the bell may be preset because the fire authority has gone out, they've done a site assessment like the Australian standard does, asked you to do, but they've done it for a whole neighbourhood and they've given you the answer. So keep that in mind, check your planning scheme. So if you're interested in bushfire attack levels and the technical construction approach to building in a bushfire-prone area, great, get to work, seek advice and make a difference through those construction techniques. And self-evidently, if you wanted to know what your bushfire attack level might be, for instance, for rebuilding after a bushfire, if a structure is destroyed, seek advice and they can work through that process with you. But we've also got to keep in mind that if you're interested in other safety approaches, get cracking on these things as well. And I'll just take us through what they might be. The first is to not make things worse. So around this country, we continue to load up our communities with bushfire hazards that undermine safety and community resilience. And that's occurring as a result of landowner actions. So there's a subdivision somewhere in Victoria around 2009, bit of grassland in that low density subdivision, but probably not a huge amount of risk. If you look forward 10 years, significant bushfire hazards have been introduced into that community. So bushfire safety is being diminished over time by introducing vegetation. Don't make things worse. Another example of that would be, this is on the Surf Coast, a new subdivision in 2010, relatively low hazard, not much vegetation in and around the settlement. 10 years later, it now looks like that. Again, through incremental landowner actions, we're increasing bushfire risks in our communities. My strong advice is, as an individual landowner, you should not do that. Next one is about bushfire vegetation management. So I talked about in the context of a bell assessment, this separation between a structure and what might be on fire. But you can also, and it's really encouraged to do that for an existing dwelling as well. So all fire authorities in this country will be strongly recommending that you create a separation between your dwelling and what's on fire. And that's relatively self-evident. Of course, they'd ask you to do that because we don't want your structure to be touched by flames. And we also want your structure far enough away where it might have some chance of withstanding the impacts of radiant heat and a bushfire. So again, there's plenty of advice on fire authority websites about how you make your garden and the land around your property more bushfire resilient. Anything you do will make a difference, and anything you do might save your life. So if you think, oh, but I've only got 5 meters, take it. 5 meters is better than no meters. Take it. If you can get 15 meters, great, take it. If you can get 20 meters, great, take it. Take what you can get, because keeping fire away from your structure is what we're trying to achieve from a life safety perspective. Keep in mind siting. So if you've got a new structure, we can use siting to reduce the bushfire risk. And this is focused on what can be done within a site through the placement of development. This may not always be a new dwelling. It could be a new shed, new garage, new outbuilding, new granny flat, any of that type of stuff. Where can you site these things? And keep in mind, siting operates irrespective of the bushfire attack level. So let's have a think about what we're trying to do with siting. We're trying to balance 3 things: maximising the separation distance between the building and the bushfire hazard. That operates irrespective of your bell. Making sure the building is in close proximity to the public road, so the fire truck might get in and you can get out. And making sure access can be provided to the building for emergency service vehicles. So consider siting options that are available before selecting a preferred location for development. So thinking about a site like this, that's the property in blue. There's some that's in the paddocks down below the mountains. There's something that sits in the mountains there. So if you look at that site, there might be a few siting options. Well, in fact, there are a few siting options, 2 in the farmlands down below, 1 up the hill. I could bet my bottom dollar that the landowner will value a view more than their life safety and will want to pick their dwelling up on the hill. Interestingly here, folks, each one of those siting options would probably get the same bushfire attack level. But you know and I know that there's different safety that comes from that. So maybe having a view isn't your priority, maybe life safety is the priority. And certainly through regulatory planning systems, we'd be seeking to get you out of the forest and down onto the grassland flats. So think about siting. We don't want to mitigate the risk only once you've put the structure into a suboptimal location. Where you put the structure is integral to bushfire resilience. On-site water supply. If you have to go through a planning or sometimes building system, you'll be forced to build an on-site water supply. But if your house was built 30 years ago, we don't have to be forced to do it. You can put a water supply out tomorrow. And you need to make sure that that water supply is filled. You need to make sure it's got a sign on it so the fire authority can find it. And you need to make sure it has a fitting on it so that the fire truck can access it. Irrespective of whether you're forced to do it by government regulation, you should do it. Last one there is property access. Again, in the unlikely event that a fire truck might actually turn up, you shouldn't rely on that. You want to make sure it can get in. And also, really importantly, you want to make sure that if you need to, you can get out. So again, you don't have to be forced to do these things. You can pick up off-the-shelf guidance and you can start to think about access onto your property. Have you got the clearance? Can the truck get in? Is there a turning area? Have you got a relatively safe pathway out to the edge of your property? These things can be thought about and done at any time. Keep in mind that even when you have a regulatory system, a building or planning system, all that they do is require you to do what fire authorities otherwise would ask you to do. That's it. Regulatory systems in this country only ask you to do what fire authorities spend a fortune trying to educate you to do anyway. There's no difference. There's no difference between community safety and you taking landowner action and what you might be forced to do through a building or planning regulatory system. It's the same stuff. And picking up that point a bit more clearly, the fundamentals of making properties more fire ready have been known for over 40 years. The CFA, for example, has been publishing guides for 40 years about this stuff. And whilst the language might change, the fundamentals don't. Keep things away from what will be on fire is a pretty straightforward proposition that we've been working at for 40 or 50 years. Landowner action is the missing piece of the puzzle. Final reflection, always remember to zoom out, folks. Always remember to zoom out to see the true nature of your bushfire risk, particularly as you're doing your bushfire attack level thinking, but also how you might be applying those other bushfire protection measures to your site. Think about that broader landscape and how much work or effort does your site need in order to prioritise your life safety for the day the bushfire comes. That's our messaging in Victoria. It's not as clear, that messaging in Tasmania. That's the other jurisdiction I'm familiar with, but folks, leaving early is always the safest option. So do everything you can on your site, maximise your bushfire protection, but get out early wherever you can. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and I'll stop sharing and hand back to Malcolm.
Thank you, Kevin. That was really concise and a fantastic explanation. We'll now move over to Justin Leonard. Thanks, Justin.
So, Kevin's articulated really concisely the process of what a bell contains. I'm here to add an extra context, which is, I guess, a lot of extra factors that I guess a bell assessment doesn't necessarily consider or incorporate. And that's to really profile this idea that a property is under attack, not just from radiant heat, which the bell contextualizes to a degree. Radiant heat is certainly a process that exposes the house and is one of the threats, but it's combined with embers, which can cause many spot fires around a structure and ignite other elements, but also be a direct attack mechanism itself, getting into gaps and igniting aspects of the house and getting inside the house. Flame contact from the fire front itself in those higher bell levels is also a feasible thing if you're close enough and don't have that relevant separation. And of course, the consequential fire, which is a term really for all those other secondary elements that might be immediately around your house or under your house or adjacent to it. So things like treated pine elements, timber fencing, wood heaps, gas bottles, evaporative coolers, mulch, all those sorts of things that you wouldn't necessarily associate as a vegetated fuel, but are typical elements we find around structures, which can play out in quite challenging ways because the surface fire attack or the ember attack or the radiant heat all work together to not just ignite your house, but ignite those things that can then go on to ignite your structure. And I guess quite importantly, this idea that we have these escalating bell levels, which are based pretty much on the premise of how much radiant heat a house might need to face, certainly escalates from the lower bell numbers. We can't survive outside at any of these bell levels from 12 up to FZ. You simply can't survive outside. The house, if designed correctly, can withstand these elements. So things like typical timbers externally and typical windows can survive up to that threshold of bell 12.5. But you then need specialist materials and start upgrading your windows as you move through 19, 29, you're into sort of, and 40, you're into sort of toughened glass windows and non-combustible facades. And Bell FZ, you're in, very bespoke design concepts and approaches to really have a house that can withstand. Now, even if you construct to those specific approaches relevant to a bell level, it doesn't mean that you've reached a high level of safety per se, because as you can see, as you move up through these levels, the external environment and the inevitability that we're going to burn all the elements around that house, which also form a direct threat to the structure and a threat that the house may not be designed for. The design is specifically for the attack of the fire front itself, not all the secondary things that happen. Could be your neighbor's house burning down, could be that wood heap, could be the fences burning out. They're all elements that are not considered by the construction standard itself. And they're all things that end up falling to the homeowner to deeply consider, prepare for, and do all that effective housekeeping. And it's that reason, quite specifically, that it's very important to design and site and manage your vegetation to get down into these lower bell levels. And ideally 29 and below is a much safer context than these Bell FZ Bell 40s, where in both of those, look, Bell FZ is really saying that the flame front that could arrive, a reasonable worst case flame front, will not only reach and contact your house, but will wrap around and largely engulf large aspects of your house, which is quite a challenging and ominous thing to consider. Bell 40 doesn't mean there's no flame contact from the fire front. It actually means the flame tips can actually lick and contact the house, just not necessarily sort of engulf it and wrap around it to that same level. So certainly ones to consider, and I guess a benefit of sort of contextualizing where you sit in this paradigm, whether you've got an existing build or you're trying to work in a constrained block, the getting that context is particularly important to frame your site. And I love coming back to this type of scenario as a constant reminder to say, look, a fire front can turn up, but it can turn up even in a relatively benign way. In this case, in the Canberra fires for Malcolm Gill, who was a renowned fire researcher, it turned up on eaten out horse paddocks and then arrived and found urban interface fuels to track through and present the hazard. So the hazard wasn't necessarily what turned up as a fire front. The hazard became what burnt out as urban fuels and urban interface processes. And he was quite clear in describing that there were two clear phases. One, which was this one depicted, where it sort of tracked around dry fuels and mulch layers around the process. He was fortunate enough to have some green lawn that didn't involve that particular process right up to the house itself. But this secondary process, which was the burning out of all the heavy fuel elements around his house, and we're talking about the fences and decks and stored materials around his structure. And he actually found it was this process that was far more challenging for him and for his house to present the attack from the burning out of these secondary elements in this case. And in fact, that was a picture Malcolm managed to take in that later stage in this phase of the process, looking out from the back of his house towards this fence along the back of his property here actually looked like that during the peak of that event, where a power pole and the fences were burning out. Now, if we sort of unpack that as a process, let's call the vegetation to the left here, it burns. It primarily burns and presents radiant heat on our, let's say we've got a shed and a neighboring shed, a fence and a house. Now, it projects radiant heat, and in a sense, the Bell calculation is determining the amount of radiant heat that in a reasonable worst case scenario is projected from the forest on the left to the house on the right. Now, what I've deliberately put here is the shed and the fence are in the way. These things are not accounted for in an assessment of Bell. They assume there's a free path between the forest and the house. If you can put anything between the forest and the house, be it low flammability vegetation, fencing, earth mounds, non-combustible sheds, you name it, all these things can help block and limit the amount of radiant heat that can reach your structure. But any element you put proximal to your house, if it's combustible or contains combustible materials, can become a flame and radiant heat source itself and become the source of of heat load on your structure. So you have to think about all these factors. Now, in this case, we're seeing the shed burning and projecting and radiating in all directions. And in fact, the fence is actually offering a degree of radiant heat blocking between you and the house. But in this case, let's assume the fence was, say, a hardwood fence, and eventually, with all of that radiant heat, flames, and ember attack, it actually ignites itself and then becomes the source of heat on the house. Now, these might occur all together, or they might occur in the sequence that I've shown. And it's not particularly clear whether in this scenario, well, it actually shows in the graph below that in fact, the arrival event wasn't necessarily the most severe exposure the house experienced. It was actually the fence burning in this final stage that presented the risk. So we need to think not just about unmanaged vegetation interacting with the house. We think of all of these other elements that could play out in relevant ways. Now, I'm a really strong believer of sort of being able to develop a sense of a mind's eye in terms of how to interpret and understand a scene, so that you can start to really interpret where your threats are coming from and how those threats present to a house, but also specifically elements on a house. So what I want to do is build a scene and take you through each of those processes. So here's a house located on a landscape. Now, I've deliberately deleted all the other elements out of this scene because I want to build it in the mind's eye, because it's very important to not just look past the typical things that we may do when we're thinking about a bushfire risk or assessment. So here's the fence. The fence is a real thing. It's a boundary fence. It could be combustible. It may in fact be non-combustible. Every context is different. We could have elements. These could be, like, for instance, a water tank. The water tank could be plastic and combustible. It could be non-combustible. We have what we commonly term as managed vegetation. It might be low threat or high threat vegetation, but an important element. And because I'm deliberately building out from the house, because this onion ring approach of coming out from the house is an excellent way to consider the issues of escalating risk of those elements as you move out from a house. The broader area, you could call this the sort of the managed zone, where we have sporadic non-connecting tree canopy and an open separation between us and, say, the continuous forest, which would be what supports a large fire front that you would be interpreting as the point what you'd measure out to determine your bell level, or where that large fire front threat might present or come from. Now, if we deliberately go, well, let's pick an element on a house and understand what its perspective is of this scene. So if I pick, say, the glass door on the deck and look out from that, it's like looking out in all directions. It's like sending out a whole lot of rays. And it's like, what is in my field of view of this window looking out into the broader scene? What is that view? And if we actually switch to the point of view of that element, we're looking out and we can see a whole lot of interesting things. So in its field of view, it's dominated by the deck and a solid balustrade. That takes up well over half of its field of view. So if that deck or balustrade was to burn, it would represent, by and large, the biggest component of heat load or radiant heat load from that scene. But peering over the top of that are the localized vegetation, which may be high or low threat, and a fair amount of the forest, which is going to present the actual fire front through it or above it or within it. And so you get a sense of that scene. So this view perspective is a very powerful tool in sort of understanding what could be presented to you, because it's this field of view approach that the Bell assessment's actually using to try and understand or interpret the amount of radiant heat exchange you might get with that scene. So if we flip back and we sort of imagine a fire front coming up through that forested area, it can project and present that threat. And in this case, it's not close enough to present direct flame immersion from the fire front, but it's going to project a fair amount of radiant heat across that scene that the house is going to feel. And here it is from the house's perspective, approaching, getting closer, and expressing itself up and out of that forest. So before it actually gets out of the forest, it's actually the forest in front of the yet to be burned in front of the fire front's actually attenuating or blocking a lot of that radiant heat. But as it expresses and presents, it's this final stage that really defines that peak radiant heat load, which is how that whole Bell calculation actually resolves. And what I wanted to highlight there is, in fact, the fire front can turn up and present a certain level. Let's say roughly this is a Bell 19 to 29 type scene that presents a certain threat. It also ignites these secondary elements like the proximal trees. And in this case, let's call them cypress pine trees. They look a bit like that. Well, the burning and flaring of those trees actually ended up at, being a greater threat than the fire front turning up itself. So it's quite important to think about this holistic approach, and rather than sort of the macro picture approach, it's great to think about those intimate elements and processes and complement those in terms of your overall understanding and approach to risk management on your side. And in this case, let's say that ignited the balustrade, and then that balustrade and deck ended up being the reason, the path or linked chain that ended up being the reason for igniting the house, just as a worked example or a way to think about how processes can unfold and present the risk to the house itself. And like houses that have external burning elements aren't necessarily the ultimate process, as certain houses can tolerate a little bit of external combustion, but once it can be sufficient to threaten or break a window or burn into the house, then the internal materials within the house can certainly be enough to burn the house out and cause its ultimate and complete demise.
Thanks, Justin. That added beautifully to the Bell presentation. For people that are trying to make judgments about their own situation. We're going to have, while we organise ourselves for the next session, we're just going to have a short BRI promotion. As you know, we do this these sessions and the information on our website so people understand their risks better. We really need support from BRI subscribers and people who watch these webinars to get the message out there. So please encourage your friends and your community group, families living close to you with bushfire risk to register and become a BRI subscriber. If you're a Facebook person, please follow our Facebook page and share our posts. And thank you to the numerous groups and individuals around Australia who've shared our posts before this webinar. If you live in Victoria, you can win a Davey single impeller firefighting pump in our raffle. Davey very generously made these pumps available to us, and we use them, of course, to raise money to manage our website and the materials that we produce. Feedback surveys are really important to us. We try to gather information so that we can make decisions about providing what it is that you want, and sharing the comments on the website actually helps other people. We, of course, run on volunteer time and grants and donations. And as BRI has grown in popularity, members of the community have asked how they can make an online donation. And you'll see in a few days, we'll email you when our website's been updated to enable donations. Thank you to our sponsors and supporters. They're really important to us. Those Bendigo Bank Community Bank branches in Nillumbik and up in Kinglake, the CFA, the Warrandyte Riverside Market, the City of Manningham, the Yarra River in Warrandyte, and Nillumbik Shire Council. And that map that's on your screen is the risk shared by most of the people in the BRI team with most of the residents of Nillumbik, and it appeared in the late Kevin Tolhurst BRI presentation in 2020. Don't forget those Davy pumps who've been so generous to us, and have a crack at winning one in our raffle. We're going to move now to a panel session. In this session, we'll be trying to answer as many of your questions as possible. But first, often stakeholders see the BEL as just a number that complicates the work they want to do. To architects, it's red tape. For builders, it's often delays, and for the homeowner, it's just an added cost, and you don't see the benefit. The BEL conversation is weighted to the downfalls instead of treating it as a valuable planning tool. For this panel, what do you think of the concept? Justin, your comment?
A BEL assessment certainly is a necessary context setter for building or upgrading a structure. And I guess, a planning or building scheme imposes requirements and that require costs, but they're quite well-intentioned and necessary, because it's really trying to set a minimum threshold of what you need to do in response to an acknowledged and certain level of threat that your building will face. So I like to think about a BEL as being a minimum compliance mechanism that we really should automatically be considering as a bare bones minimum that we should be striving to exceed well into what I would call the best practice realm, which is going far beyond that and building something that's completely adequate. So it's like a proactive opportunity to harden and build an appropriate structure rather than sort of bumping up against a regulatory imposition or process.
Kevin or Mark, anything to add to that? Microphone's on. Yep.
I guess there is something deeply embedded in the culture of the country where bushfire as a hazard and a risk isn't taken seriously. And we know that, as I mentioned, about the 40 years of advice from fire authorities about what to do, but yet here we are still talking about what to do in a very rudimentary way. We know that there's a significant cultural problem with the idea that bushfire is a constraint on development. In a way, for example, the Northern Hemisphere, you build for snow. Don't think twice about it. They don't deny it. They're not in denial. You get on with it. We're in a bushfire country. You build for bushfire. But yet we are on a journey that's seeking to strengthen that over time. Unfortunately, major events and the disasters that come with them kick the system along. In Victoria, Ash Wednesday, Black Saturday across the country, the Black Summer fires, those types of things kick us along. But I would always say, what are we valuing as a society and as a country? And I think life safety in response to bushfire is valuable and worth doing. And the regulatory costs that comes with it not only can be borne, but must be borne.
I suppose another theme in this idea of homeowners and builders coming to grips with this, and architects and so on, is if they connect together with a simple meeting at the start of the process, then the bushfire risk can be articulated by the bushfire consultant and the expectations of the BEL can be managed and so on. Do you believe the homeowner needs to be the one that instigates these sorts of discussions? It's not probably going to happen on its own. Mark, you're involved in this.
Yeah, look, well, at the end of the day, the homeowner's the one that the project's for. But often the homeowner will just engage the architect, and the architect will drive things from start to finish in the background. And some of these decisions around, say, best practice, like Justin was talking to before, aren't necessarily discussed with the homeowner. Sort of picking up on the point before, we regularly have a conversation with people where they think it's a win to have a lower BEL. I'm only 12 and a half, I'm not 29. Whereas if you're starting to pick up on some of those concepts like Justin was talking to before, in some instances, there's not actually a significant difference in cost. In some instances, you're significantly adding to your level of protection by picking a different material or by moving up that level of compliance. And it's not always, or it's very rarely a bad thing.
Kevin, Justin, anything to add?
Well, yeah, probably just to emphasize the fact that, look, even if you just take this minimum compliance path, you get your BEL, you constructed the BEL, you might be surprised, but that actually only gets you to about an 80% survival rate for houses. So, weigh that up against what your personal expectation might be once you've gone through the process of building and complying. Is an 80% survival prospect reliable enough for you in your context? Do you think or assume you'd want to be significantly better than that? Yeah. And I guess for homeowners that have an existing home, for example, understanding their BEL is quite a powerful thing. If you go and to consider sort of an extension, that might trigger a building or planning permit or both. That means that your extension needs to comply to the BEL level. Knowing that up front and considering it and working out what you're going to do with the rest of your house. If it's a significant extension, it might trigger an upgrade to your entire house. These are all costs that you want to deeply understand at the earliest possible stage in that process of considering, can you afford it? How are you going to go about it? What materials are you going to use? What does this opportunity present? When people discover these things halfway through a process and they have to down tools, reconsider their financing, they all of a sudden flip into that negative, this is such an imposition, I resent this process mindset almost straight away. And to be honest, they're largely to blame for not anticipating and understanding the implications of this. And I guess this webinar is a great opportunity to try and help people shift to a proactive thinking process and use this as quite a useful tool.
The defendable space vegetation management prescriptions in the bushfire management overlay are a one-size-fits-all approach for all vegetation types. Should there be a different set of prescriptions for different vegetation types? For example, one for a scrubby area on the Mornington Peninsula versus a different prescription for forested areas near Kinglake. And I'm going to take a punt and say, Mark, you might have a crack at that.
Yeah, I would argue that, well, I do agree that the vegetation management requirements in the planning scheme are a very blunt instrument, and they are a one size fits all, and they have been written, I guess, in that sort of planning enforcement type language, so that the average council planner or average council planning enforcement officer can pick them up and apply them. And it's similar to when you're undertaking your BAL assessment. Often these things are quite tricky once you start to try and apply them to the real world. You know, are two small trees together? Does the canopy need to be separated or not separated, and those sorts of things? And it all comes into play depending on the types of the vegetation. If you're looking at some of those coastal type vegetation that is generally just a shrubby layer, well, the conditions talk to that. They say no more than 50% coverage of that shrubby layer. You just don't have the tree component, just of those requirements just isn't relevant to you. One of the things that the Victorian system does allow, though, and in that table is when your planning application is coming in, there's the ability for CFA or the ability for your bushfire planning consultant to suggest other ways to manage that vegetation, which can be shown on that bushfire management plan. Again, this is a very sort of Victorian context. We can review that. We can look at how the fire arrives on site, like Justin was talking to before. We can consider, you know, what the chances of canopy fire is and that sort of thing, and we can allow for more or less vegetation, or, you know, less understory because we've got more overstory and that sort of thing.
Kevin, this might be a question for you. How can we challenge the BEL rating for our property, as the properties on either side of us have a much lower BEL rating?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll go back to the BEL assessment process. The neighbours, the properties on either side of you may have different vegetation on the other side of them, and that's what's driving their bushfire attack level. So there's no reason why you would get the same bushfire attack level as your neighbour. Every site does the assessment. They look at all sides of their structure, and they will have different vegetation types and different slopes around their structure, and that will drive the BEL. So there's no reason why they'd be standard. The second thing is, though, that if you think there's something technically wrong in your bushfire attack level and its preparation, or commission another one.
Justin, a question for you. Does cladding my cedar weatherboard house with ColourBond steel reduce my bushfire risk?
Oh, it certainly, that removes one key element or process in a chain, but without sort of understanding that the rest of your unique circumstance, you might have one or many weaknesses in your structure, but that would be an obvious way to take out one line item in possibly a short or a long list of things you need to tackle to bring your risk well down. I sort of follow the weakest link principle, where there could be a whole range of ways your house could ultimately burn down, and it's only really once you've addressed all the ways that could lead to your property's loss that you've achieved an outcome. But that sounds like a really sound step in what's possibly a more complex and comprehensive process.
A practical question, I think this might be for you, Justin, too, perhaps Mark. Where do I find information about how to seal my downpipes so that the whole lot of muck doesn't go into my 100,000 litre water storage tank? No town water supply to the property. There's lots of products, as far as I know.
Yeah, that's right. There's many screening and filter products, ones that are fitted to the downpipes on the downpipe process themselves. Others, and they can work in combination with the screening and filters at the water tank itself. There's first flush diverters. There's a whole lot of those processes, and most of those elements work just fine with good bushfire design. They don't necessarily bring in additional risk, provided you clean out the accumulated debris in those catching systems. But yeah, there are lots and lots of products on the market.
You're probably better to just install a quality gutter guard in the first instance. Keep that debris out of the gutters and away from any type of ember attack, and stop stop that stuff getting into the system to begin with.
Mm. I think this is a Justin question. Are solar batteries an issue during fire?
The installation of solar batteries doesn't specifically consider the implications of a bushfire risk, but they do consider a bunch of fire-related risks themselves, like what they're attached to, what they're immediately proximal to, keeping them out of the sun or high sun loads. But they are inherently designed to manage their own heat and manage their own overheating processes. They've got internal cooling fans and are encased in ways that limit their ability to present a challenge. But certainly if they're presented with a very high heat load or direct flame contact, they may become involved and burn themselves. So think about their practical location and what would be the implication if they did go off. But they certainly aren't, I wouldn't put them in the fragile category where they're going to go off at an above average, a particularly hot day with a little bit of radiant heat or whatnot. So, and it's also worth considering that they don't represent a massive amount of energy in themselves. A good rule of thumb is to say one of those typical, say, a Tesla Powerwall really contains less overall energy than 1 or 2 litres of petrol.
I like this idea. When providing input to land use planning for bushfire preparedness, is support for property holders to navigate complex new requirements included? Could a concierge model at a local government level help streamline this process? What do you think, Kevin, of that idea of a concierge model at local council?
Yeah, look, I mean, clearly, if resources were available, that would be great. Just keep in mind that we probably do have that functioning at the moment. So I know, for example, the CFA might seem like a big, scary corporate entity, but actually, if you call them, someone will answer the phone and they'll answer your question. Council planners are largely providing a concierge service, trying to connect through your planning application, the different elements around veg management, site access, working through with the CFA and those types of things. So it does kind of happen. It probably could be smoother, but then I could look at every planning issue across the state and say it could be smoother as well. So, but keep in mind that sort of the concierge model is the fundamental basis of the planning system in Victoria, that a council is a responsible authority and they help the applicant make an application and to send it around to who needs to be sent to and to come back with a moderated answer. So just keep that in mind. But self-evidently, where resources are available, that can be good. A concierge model is obviously being used for rebuilds. So state government rolls out with councils a rebuild team when bushfires occurred, and that helps people get through the system. So there's no doubt there's models out there, but it needs government willingness to do it.
Here's a question that you might have answered, but maybe not. Why isn't there a standard bell rating assigned by council to the whole township? In other words, the highest rating that would affect everyone, I suppose.
Yeah, so that's similar to the question earlier about why is my neighbour's block different. As you move around a town, the bushfire hazard close to your individual site will be different. So the west of town might be next to a river, the east of town might be next to a national park. Your bushfire attack level would respond to those different hazards. There isn't often an answer for the whole town. Where there is an answer for the whole town, you've got a town that's relatively low hazard, and the answer is mostly about ember protection, and it could be a bell 12.5. And that is expressed in some of our schedules to the bushfire management overlay, where the planning scheme does specify bushfire attack level for a whole town. But that's by exception, because the hazard is homogenous throughout the town. And we've gone out and done an assessment that replicates an assessment on each site, but we've macroed it up to the town level. But in most towns, the hazard is different as you move about the town, and therefore the bushfire attack level would be different. The only exception to that is where, as a matter of government policy, the government imposes a bushfire attack level. So to give you an example, Marysville has a minimum bushfire attack level of bell 29. If you do an individual bell assessment in the middle of town, you'd probably get a 12.5. But the government, as a matter of policy, specifies bell R429 because it wants the extra amber protection and the extra radiant heat protection. So there are examples of that where government imposes policy above an individual BEL assessment and just says that's the answer. But people have the legitimate opportunity to consider what's going on around their site, to have a bushfire attack level that responds to that and to get on with it. And that's the way the system's designed, and that's a good thing in my mind.
Just to follow on, Kevin, with you, do you need to spend dollars to engage an expert to give a BEL rating, or can you self-assess?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me there, Malcolm. I thought I could self-build a shed from Bunnings the other week, and I failed halfway through and 8 hours later. So what I'd say is that if you're motivated and you can turn your mind to this stuff, great. There are plenty of people in the community who understand this stuff and can open an Australian standard and can find their way through it. But if that's not you, seek help. Keep in mind a BEL assessment. You know, I don't do BEL assessments anymore for individual properties. I'm more public sector focused. But a BEL assessment, $300-400. Like, what's the price of your life safety and the safety of your family? And I know there's people on the line where that's a lot of money for people, but we need to think about what is the cost of life safety and of getting this stuff done. A BEL assessment is not an expensive part of the system. It's actually cheaper than the soil assessment I just paid to get for my new house I'm trying to build down here. Like, let's not overstate the regulatory costs of these things in thinking about it. But by all means, if you've got the skills, get on and do it. I've taken you through the table. You work out your veg type, you work out your slope, you work out how close or far you are from the bushfire hazard. If you can change vegetation, do it. You might get a different answer and then get on with it. So you can do it. What I'd say is use the tool if you can as a guide, and then work out whether you need to then get further advice. If you're just curious about what it would be, you could probably do it yourself. If you're going to enter a regulatory system, you're probably going to want to seek advice.
A question for you, Justin. I think in the spirit of anything we can do to improve the odds is beneficial, do you have a recommended sources that we can look for examples of what's worked for other people or could slightly reduce combustibility? For example, realistic improvements to large wooden frame windows or verandas, mitigating particular eave designs, and so on and so on.
Yeah, I guess there's so many sort of many and varied elements that you really have to sort of sit back, assess your understanding and build up your knowledge in terms of what best practice or exemplar design and construction actually looks like. I'd refer you straight to what we would call bushfire best practice guides, of which we've written a few and have them as online resources. And I think, you know, the answer to that question is becoming deeply aware of all the content on the BRI website, which I think takes you through nearly every possible element and gives you, you know, a good, better, best context for where you might take those things, as does the best practice guides and approaches. It's always a tricky contextual thing. Or like, you've got an old timber window. Do you paint it? Do you coat it with a intumescing or fire resistant paint, or do you swap it out for a newer window that might have a higher thermal efficiency? They're all challenging judgmental questions, but I tend to point you towards every upgrade you make. Look for all the improvements. Might be durability, energy efficiency, and robustness in a bushfire. You can find upgrades in materials and systems that tick all of those boxes simultaneously, that usually don't fight against each other as concepts.
I think this question probably is for you too, Justin, although Mark might want to comment. There's people say we're at the pointy end of our BEL 40 build in Kalorama in Victoria and are unsure about gutter guard. Is this highly recommended? We have had differing opinions from plumbers, builders and council. Help.
Oh, that's an easy answer. Highly recommended. There isn't a circumstance where gutter guard isn't a benefit as a limiter of it as another mechanism to get in and start attacking eaves and your framing within your roof, and of course that side benefit of keeping your runoff water quality in better condition and saving you the hassle of having to get up and clean your unblocked gutters at a semi-regular basis, which in many circumstances is a life risk in itself.
I guess this is related. These people say our house is a new build, brick, double glazed aluminium windows and doors, no external timber. We have a timber look aluminium cladding, concrete al fresco, no timber decking. The one thing we couldn't change was the timber frame. Other than sealing the roof as much as possible, is there anything else we can do to reduce the risk of the frame igniting? I think it's you, Justin.
Yeah, keep your roof in good condition and be aware of all the gaps around along the ridges and sheet joints and at the gutter interface. So that's back to gutter guards. There's sort of certain little metal deflectors you can put in around your gutters. So if you did have a small flame source burning in the gutter, it burns up against a bit of metal flashing rather than sort of tracking up under your roof sheets, and sealing under your ridge capping, or making sure your ridge capping's properly sealed off so that there's no amber access into those too. I assume also it's a Bell 40 roof, so it would have a sarking material over it. Don't rely on the sarking as a barrier necessarily. If it gets any small flame contact on that sarking, it'll simply burn a hole through it. So anything you can do in front of that sarking to act as an extra barrier is a key approach.
This questioner says that an insurance company arranged a bell rating for our property. The report was obviously taken selectively from Google Maps without a site visit and significantly misrepresented the actual situation, giving a lower bell, which affected the repair cost. Is this typical of the consultants out there? Kevin, I think that's one for you.
Well, it's not typical of this consultant. All bushfire assessments, you need to walk onto the site. So, I mean, I think that's really important. I guess I'm not sure what the terminology is, but insurance that has them rebuilding your dwelling to current regulations is the insurance policy to take. I'm building in a flood area and they gave me two options, some sort of fixed price replacement or actual replacement, and I took the actual replacement. So I think that's the motto there. Don't rely on anything that's an input on a desktop assessment.
I'd also advise that person to have a look at our previous two webinars on insurance, because there's people that can assist with challenging that. And one of the you'd either go to an ombudsman or look at getting a more professional assessment done, I would suggest. This person says, I'm considering installing an external fire sprinkler system on our country home. Do you have any comments about the effectiveness of a professionally installed system? Mark, you want to answer that one?
Yeah, look, I guess one of the limitations with bushfire spray systems is just the level of regulation there is out there and what you actually get at the end of the process. But certainly there's many instances where well-installed spray systems have done a particularly good job or largely resulted in the building surviving the fire. So I think it's like all these things. It's about doing your research, finding the right installer, because it can get pretty complicated. That make sure you've got an adequate water supply, make sure your sprinkler heads are delivering the water as it needs to be, so that on the really hot windy day when the fire comes through, the water's actually being delivered where it needs to be delivered, and all those sorts of things. But yeah, I think the key message is yes, they definitely can. They can be on the more expensive end of measures you might take. And yeah, there may be other passive things that you can do to your building before you need to go to that extreme potentially.
That's our last question. Justin, do you want to add anything into that? Because you've seen a lot of these homes that have sprinkler systems.
Yeah, I think the fact that it's a registered or reputable sprinkler installer doesn't mean it's going to be ultra reliable and work for yourself. I think the homeowner needs to sort of, I guess, take ownership and consideration of the ultimate design, and be proactive in specifying what they want as well. And there's some excellent BRI webinars that focus specifically on considerations around design, like what pump to use, suitably located, how to make a really reliable water supply, piping selection, wind considerations, high wind considerations for spray systems, a whole bunch of stuff. You really want to make sure it's going to meet your expectation.
We're going to have to finish there. Thank you, Justin, Kevin, and Mark for your input, and Justin and Kevin for your presentations. Following tonight's webinar, you'll receive a short confidential feedback survey. Please take a few minutes to respond. BRI will keep subscribers informed about information uploaded to our website. I'd like to acknowledge Max Garner, Mark Gravel, John Huff, Lisa O'Brien, Peter Mildenhall, Max Coleman, Jason McFadden, Linda Snell and Rob Reed-Smith for their commitment in conducting and promoting this webinar series and for maintaining our very informative website. Thank you also to Tammy Garrett of the CFA for her response to questions during the webinar, and to Glenn Albiston, Arthur Coates and Maggie Broom for their assistance. A very special thank you to Rowan Thornton of CFA District 14, our Zoom host, who again did a great job. Our next webinar is on Tuesday, the 28th of November. Justin Leonard will be joined by Kevin Parkin and Mika Peace from the Bureau of Meteorology for a must-watch webinar entitled Understanding Our Changing Bushfire Weather. Thank you and good night. We had 135 people online at the peak. Much appreciated. See you again.